My dad laughed when I begged for a real nurse so I could sleep. He said, "Why would we pay someone to do what you do for free?" When I finally opened up to the state worker, my parents said I was a troubled teen making it up for attention. I stayed silent. That was 2 years ago. This morning, they were standing outside the courthouse in matching jumpsuits, arguing about who should take the fall. What responsibility did you never ask for? When I was 9 years old, my parents started taking in medically fragile children for the government paycheck, and I became the one who kept them alive while my parents collected $30,000 a month. My parents discovered the foster care goldmine when our neighbor mentioned how much the state paid for special needs placements. Within 6 months, they'd welcomed 3 medically fragile children: Sadie, who needed a ventilator; Caleb, who was deaf; and baby Millie, born without the ability to swallow. The social workers praised my parents for opening their hearts to children no one else wanted. What they didn't see was my parents ordering me to figure out how to manage feeding pumps, suction trachs, and calculate medication dosages. "You're so good at this," Mom would say, watching me struggle with Millie's G-tube at midnight. Natural little nurse. Dad was already calculating how many more children they could fit in the house. By the time I was 11, we had 6 children who required round-the-clock medical care, and I hadn't slept through the night in 2 years. My parents had perfected their system. They attended the meetings, signed the papers, and smiled for the social workers while I did everything else. The children were mine in every way that mattered. Sadie would only calm down when I sang to her. Caleb spelled out "I love you" in sign language every night before bed. Millie smiled her first smile at me, not them. I'd rush home from school to check on them, do homework while monitoring oxygen levels, fall asleep sitting up between their beds in case someone needed me. I kept meticulous notes in composition notebooks, tracking every symptom and dose and output, because these children deserved someone who paid attention, even if that someone was barely a teenager herself. Meanwhile, my parents lived like lottery winners on the money meant for the children's care. They bought new cars, took weekend trips, renovated the kitchen while I made do with expired formula and recycled medical supplies. When I begged for a real nurse to help, even just for a few hours so I could sleep, Dad laughed. "Why would we pay someone to do what you do for free?" When I was 15, the state announced surprise inspections after another family got caught neglecting their foster children. The night before the inspection, Sadie developed pneumonia. Her oxygen levels dropped dangerously low and she needed immediate hospital care. But my parents refused to take her. "If she's in the hospital during inspection, they'll think we can't handle her needs," Mom said. I watched Sadie struggle for every breath, her lips turning dusky. I couldn't let her die for their inspection, so I called 911 myself, claiming to be home alone with a sick sister. My parents arrived at the hospital playing the concerned caregivers, but the hospital social worker noted that a 15-year-old had been alone with 6 medically fragile children. The inspection the next day was a disaster. The state worker asked my parents to demonstrate Millie's feeding routine, and they didn't even know where her pump was. The worker interviewed me separately, and I was so exhausted and so worried about Sadie still in the hospital that I just broke. I showed her my notebooks, the medical logs I'd kept, the alarm schedule I'd created to manage 6 children's needs alone. My parents tried damage control, claiming I was a troubled teen making up stories for attention, but the evidence was overwhelming. The state removed all 6 children immediately. I watched them take my babies away while my parents raged about lost income. Sadie reached for me through the ambulance window. Caleb signed, "Where are you going?" as they loaded him in. Within a week, my parents had kicked me out. I was 16, homeless, and missing 6 pieces of my heart who were scattered to different medical foster homes across the state. But I pulled myself up. I got my CNA certification, worked multiple jobs, and hired a lawyer, all because I wanted to be able to see the kids. The judge finally granted me supervised visits, but the meetings broke my heart. Sadie had regressed, no longer responding to our songs. Caleb had forgotten most of his sign language. Millie didn't remember me at all. The other 3 weren't any better off. A year into visits, I got a call. Sadie had been hospitalized with pneumonia her foster parents hadn't caught in time. She was intubated, declining rapidly, making sounds the nurses couldn't understand, but I knew. She was calling for me the only way she could. I drove 3 hours to find Sadie alone in the ICU. The moment I took her hand and sang our song, her oxygen levels improved. The social worker pulled me aside with news that made my knees weak. All 6 children were failing in their separate placements. The state would place all 6 with me if I could meet the requirements within 72 hours. Approved housing with medical modifications, $20,000 in deposits and equipment, proof of stable income. I had none of it. 3 days to accomplish the impossible, or they'd move forward with permanent placements out of state. I sat by Sadie's bed calculating hopeless math. The other 5 were being prepared for transfer. Caleb to Oregon, Millie to a facility in Nevada, the twins to separate homes. My babies were being scattered because poverty was the one disease I couldn't cure with love and sleepless nights. The social worker had given me a deadline. Monday at 5 p.m., the placements would be finalized. It was Friday night. I had 2 business days to become rich enough to deserve the children I'd kept alive since I was 9 years old. And then my lawyer called me. They'd gotten another petition from someone who wanted the kids, my parents. They said I would be an unfit guardian, and they said they had proof. I stared at my phone, my hands shaking. My parents, the same people who'd thrown me out at 16 for protecting the children they'd neglected, were now trying to take them back. Not because they loved them, because the monthly checks had started flowing again. My lawyer explained the situation while I paced the hospital corridor. My parents had filed an emergency petition claiming I was mentally unstable and had kidnapped the children during my supervised visits. They'd submitted falsified documents showing I'd missed multiple scheduled visits and had threatened social workers. None of it was true, but they'd somehow gotten signatures and dates that looked official. The worst part was their timing. They knew about my 72-hour deadline. They knew I was scrambling to meet the state's requirements. This petition would force an immediate hearing, eating up precious time I didn't have. I hung up and leaned against the wall, fighting the urge to scream. Through the ICU window, I could see Sadie's small form connected to machines. Her foster parents hadn't visited once since she'd been admitted. The nurses told me she'd been alone for 3 days before I arrived. My phone buzzed with a text from my landlord. He'd heard about my situation through a mutual friend and was willing to rent me his larger property, the one with wheelchair access and medical equipment hookups, but he needed first month, last month, and security deposit by Monday morning, $8,000. I had $3,000 in savings, every penny I'd scraped together over the past year. The social worker appeared at my elbow, her face grim. She handed me a thick folder. Inside were photos of the other 5 children in their current placements. Caleb looked thin, his eyes dull. Millie's feeding tube site was red and infected. The twins were in separate homes, both failing to thrive. The youngest had developed new respiratory issues his foster parents hadn't noticed until he'd turned blue during a routine check. She explained that my parents' petition complicated everything. The judge would need to review it before approving my placement. That could take weeks. Unless I could prove their claims were false and demonstrate I had everything ready by Monday, the out-of-state placements would proceed. I spent the next hour at Sadie's bedside, holding her hand and singing softly while my mind raced. I needed $17,000 in 2 days. I needed to disprove my parents' lies. I needed to be in 6 places at once, checking on each child, gathering evidence, securing housing. My CNA supervisor called as I was leaving the hospital. Word had gotten out about my situation. She'd talked to the administrator about giving me an advance on my salary. They could do $3,000, but that was it. I accepted gratefully, even though it barely made a dent in what I needed. The drive back to my studio apartment took 2 hours. I used the time to make calls. My first was to the social services office. I requested copies of every visit log, every sign-in sheet, every document relating to my supervised visits with the children. The clerk said she could have them ready by Monday. Too late. I explained my situation, the 72-hour deadline, my parents' false petition. She put me on hold. When she came back, her voice was softer. She'd spoken to her supervisor. If I could get there before they closed at 5, she'd print everything I needed. It was already 3:30. I pushed the speed limit, making it to the office with 10 minutes to spare. The stack of papers she handed me was my proof, showing perfect attendance at every visit, glowing reports from supervisors, not a single complaint or incident. But I still needed money. That night, I did something I'd sworn I'd never do. I called my aunt, my mother's sister who'd cut contact with our family years ago. She listened in silence as I explained everything, from the time I was 9 until now. When I finished, she was crying. She couldn't give me money, she said. She was on disability, barely making ends meet. How did a 9-year-old figure out all those medical machines and medicine amounts? The way they learned to use feeding pumps and breathing tubes by themselves is incredible. I wonder if they watched videos or just tried different things until it worked, but she had something else. She'd been recording phone calls with my mother for years, ever since their falling out. In those recordings, my mother bragged about the foster care scheme, laughed about making me do all the work, admitted she saw the children as nothing more than paychecks. My aunt emailed me the files that night, 17 recordings spanning 3 years. It was evidence of my parents' true nature, but I still needed money for the house. Saturday morning, I woke to my phone ringing nonstop. My story had somehow made it onto a local parenting forum. A mother who'd seen it had cross-posted to other groups. People were offering help. $5 here, $20 there. Someone had set up a crowdfunding page. I spent the morning driving between the children's placements, documenting their conditions with the social worker's permission. What I saw broke my heart. These children who'd thrived under my care, despite the impossible circumstances, were withering away in homes that saw them as burdens rather than blessings. At Caleb's placement, I found him sitting alone in a corner, rocking back and forth. His foster mother admitted she didn't know sign language and hadn't arranged for an interpreter. He'd been isolated for months, unable to communicate with anyone. When he saw me, he lit up and immediately signed, "Where have you been?" over and over. I showed him my phone, typing out messages explaining I was trying to bring him home. He clung to me when I had to leave, and I had to physically pry his fingers from my shirt. Millie's placement was worse. The infection around her feeding tube had been going on for weeks. Her foster parents had been treating it with over-the-counter antibiotic cream instead of taking her to a doctor. She was listless, dehydrated. I demanded they take her for immediate medical care and documented everything with photos and videos. By Saturday evening, the crowdfunding had raised $8,000. Combined with my savings and the advance, I had $14,000, still $6,000 short. My parents had caught wind of what I was doing and were now threatening legal action for defamation. Sunday morning brought a breakthrough. My former high school teacher, who'd been following the situation on social media, reached out. Her church had an emergency fund for families in crisis. They'd held an emergency meeting and voted to contribute $5,000. Another $1,000 came from a local business owner who'd employed me as a teenager and remembered how I'd always talked about my kids. I had the money. Barely, but I had it. Sunday afternoon was spent signing leases, arranging for medical equipment delivery, and setting up the house. Volunteers from the community showed up to help. A retired nurse offered to provide respite care for free. A contractor installed grab bars and ramps at no charge. By evening, the house was ready, but my parents weren't done. Sunday night, as I was organizing the mountain of paperwork needed for Monday's deadline, my lawyer called with devastating news. My parents had filed an emergency injunction claiming the crowdfunded money was rightfully theirs, since they were the children's former guardians. They'd found a judge to hear the case Monday morning, hours before my deadline. I sat in my empty new house, surrounded by medical equipment and donated supplies, and felt everything slipping away. My parents had found a way to weaponize the system against me one more time. Even with all the evidence, all the community support, all the proof of their neglect and my dedication, they might still win simply because they knew how to manipulate the legal system better than I did. The social worker called to confirm Monday's meeting, 5 p.m. sharp. If I didn't have everything in place, including resolution of my parents' injunction, the children would be scattered across the country by Tuesday morning. I spent that night preparing for the fight of my life. I organized every piece of evidence, my notebooks from childhood, the visit logs, my aunt's recordings, photos of the children's current conditions, statements from medical professionals about their declining health. I practiced what I would say to the judge, how I would prove that my parents' sudden interest was purely financial. Monday morning arrived too quickly. I dressed in my only suit and drove to the courthouse. My entire future and the futures of 6 children riding on the next few hours. My parents were already there, looking prosperous and respectable. They'd hired an expensive lawyer. They'd prepared their own set of documents. As I walked past them to enter the courtroom, my mother smiled. It was the same smile she'd worn when the social workers praised her for taking in medically fragile children. The same smile she'd had when she told me I was a natural little nurse while forcing me to work through the night. I smiled back, because this time, I wasn't a scared 9-year-old trying to keep babies alive in the dark. This time, I had truth on my side. And in just a few hours, one way or another, this would all be over. The bailiff called the court to order at exactly 9 a.m. I took my seat at the defendant's table, my lawyer beside me looking through her notes one last time. My parents sat across the aisle with their attorney, a man in an expensive suit who kept checking his gold watch. The judge entered and reviewed the emergency petition. He asked my parents' lawyer to present their case first. The man stood and began outlining their claims with practiced ease. He presented forged documents suggesting I'd been erratic during visits, that I'd made threats against social workers, that I'd attempted to kidnap the children during supervised meetings. I watched my parents nod along, their faces arranged in expressions of concern. My mother dabbed at her eyes with a tissue she'd brought specifically for this performance. My father sat rigid, playing the role of the worried patriarch trying to protect innocent children. Their lawyer called my mother to testify first. She took a stand and began weaving a story about how I'd always been troubled, how they'd tried to help me but I'd turned violent and unstable after the children were removed. She claimed I'd stalked them, sent threatening messages, and had been plotting to steal the children for years. My lawyer objected repeatedly, but the judge allowed much of the testimony to continue. I forced myself to remain calm, taking notes on every lie, every fabrication. My mother's performance was convincing to anyone who didn't know the truth. When it was time for cross-examination, my lawyer stood slowly. She asked my mother to describe Millie's feeding schedule. My mother fumbled, giving vague answers about following doctor's orders. When pressed for specifics about G-tube maintenance, she couldn't provide them. My lawyer then asked about Sadie's ventilator settings. My mother claimed she didn't handle the technical aspects, that they'd had nurses for that. But when asked to name even one of these supposed nurses, she couldn't. The cracks in her story were beginning to show. My father took a stand next, doubling down on their claims about my instability. He presented himself as a businessman who'd sacrificed his career to care for special needs children, only to have his ungrateful daughter try to destroy their family. He claimed the money from the state had barely covered expenses, that they'd gone into debt caring for the children. During his cross-examination, my lawyer asked him to explain the new cars, the kitchen renovation, the weekend trips. He claimed these were necessary for transporting the children and maintaining a suitable home environment. When asked why a beach resort weekend was necessary for children who required constant medical care, he had no answer. The judge called a recess. I spent the break in a small conference room with my lawyer, going over my testimony. She warned me that my parents had done damage with their emotional appeals. The forged documents looked authentic enough to raise doubts. We needed to present overwhelming evidence to counter their narrative. When court resumed, it was my turn. I took the stand and began at the beginning, describing how my parents had discovered the foster care system's payment structure. I detailed the nights spent learning medical procedures from YouTube videos because my parents wouldn't pay for proper training. I explained the composition notebooks I'd kept, the meticulous records that had saved these children's lives countless times. My lawyer introduced my evidence piece by piece, the visit logs showing perfect attendance, the glowing reports from supervisors, the photos I'd taken just days ago showing the children's deteriorating conditions in their current placements. Each piece of evidence chipped away at my parents' fabricated story. Then came my aunt's recordings. The judge listened as my mother's voice filled the courtroom, laughing about how she'd found the perfect scheme. In one recording, she bragged to my aunt about never having to change a diaper or clean a feeding tube because her 9-year-old daughter did everything. In another, she discussed plans to take in more children once they figured out how to fit more beds in the house. My parents' faces had gone pale. Their lawyer objected, claiming the recordings were obtained illegally, but my lawyer had already verified that my aunt lived in a one-party consent state. The recordings were admissible. The most damaging recording came last. In it, my mother explicitly stated that she'd kicked me out because I'd called 911 for Sadie, costing them their monthly payments. She used words I won't repeat here, calling me ungrateful for not letting the child die quietly to preserve their income stream. My father tried to stand to say something, but his lawyer pulled him back down. The damage was done. The judge asked pointed questions about the children's current conditions. Talk about keeping receipts. 17 recordings over 3 years makes Nixon's tapes look like amateur hour. Aunt really played the long game here while mom was busy playing foster parent on easy mode. I described each placement, the medical neglect I'd witnessed, the regression in their development. I showed him photos of Millie's infected feeding tube site, videos of Caleb's isolation and despair. I explained how Sadie's oxygen levels had improved the moment I'd held her hand in the ICU. My parents' lawyer tried to salvage their case during cross-examination. He questioned the authenticity of the recordings, suggested I'd manipulated the photos, implied I'd coached the children during visits, but each attack fell flat against the mountain of evidence. The judge called another recess to review everything. Those 30 minutes felt like hours. I paced the hallway, checking my phone constantly. The crowdfunding page had raised another $2,000 during the hearing as people followed updates from someone in the gallery. When we returned, the judge's decision was swift and decisive. He found my parents' petition to be fraudulent and malicious. He noted the clear evidence of their past neglect and current deception. He ordered them to pay my legal fees and warned that criminal charges for perjury could follow. But we weren't done. I still had to meet with the state at 5 p.m. with everything in place. I raced from the courthouse to the bank, depositing the crowdfunded money and getting cashier's checks for the rental deposits. My hands shook as I signed paperwork, knowing I had hours left to pull everything together. At the medical supply company, I found my order had been mysteriously canceled. The clerk pulled up the records and showed me that someone had called that morning claiming to be me, canceling everything. The caller ID showed my parents' home number. Even after losing in court, they were still trying to sabotage me. I had to start over, selecting equipment, arranging delivery, paying rush fees I couldn't afford. The company's manager heard about my situation and waived the rush charges, promising delivery by 3 p.m. Another small miracle in a day that needed many. My phone rang constantly as I drove between errands. The social worker called to confirm she'd received the court's decision. My lawyer called to warn me that my parents had been seen at the social services office, likely trying one last manipulation. My CNA supervisor called to confirm they'd adjusted my schedule to accommodate 6 children's needs. The medical equipment arrived at the new house as promised. Volunteers from the morning setup crew returned to help arrange everything. A pediatric nurse from the local hospital showed up on her day off, helping me check that each room met medical requirements. We installed monitors, organized medication stations, tested every piece of equipment. By 4 p.m., everything was ready. The house looked like a miniature medical facility, but a warm one. I'd hung the drawings Caleb had made during our visits. Sadie's favorite stuffed animal waited on her specially equipped bed. The kitchen was stocked with the specific formulas each child needed. I arrived at the social services office at 4:30, arms full of documentation, lease agreements, bank statements, equipment receipts, letters of support from medical professionals, my work schedule showing adequate income, the court's decision from that morning, everything they'd asked for and more. My parents were there. Of course they were there. They sat in the waiting area with their lawyer, preparing for one last attempt to destroy my chances. My mother glared at me with pure hatred. My father wouldn't even look in my direction. direction. The social worker called me in first. She reviewed every document carefully, asked detailed questions about my preparations. She'd already sent someone to inspect the house that afternoon, and the report was glowing. Every requirement had been met or exceeded. Then she dropped a bombshell. My parents had filed a complaint with the state licensing board about my CNA certification, claiming I'd falsified my training records. If my license was under investigation, I couldn't be approved as a medical foster parent. I felt the room spin. After everything, after coming so close, they'd found one last way to hurt me. The social worker saw my face and quickly added that she'd already called the licensing board. They'd reviewed my records that afternoon. My certification was spotless, my training verified by multiple instructors. The complaint had been dismissed as baseless. My parents were called in next. They tried everything. They claimed the house wasn't really mine, that the crowdfunded money was fraudulently obtained, that I'd intimidated witnesses. Their lawyer presented new documents, affidavits from people I'd never heard of swearing they'd seen me behave erratically. The social worker stopped them mid-presentation. She'd done her own investigation over the weekend after receiving their petition. She'd interviewed the nurses who'd worked in the ICU with Sadie. She'd spoken to my employers, my landlords, even my high school teachers. Every single person had confirmed my stability, my dedication, my competence. More importantly, she'd pulled the records from when the children were in my parents' care. The file was thick with concerning reports that had been somehow overlooked. Notes from mandated reporters about a 9-year-old managing complex medical equipment. Hospital records showing multiple children admitted with preventable complications. Financial audits that were never completed. She asked my parents directly why they'd never provided proper medical training for their daughter if she was caring for the children. Why their bank records showed luxury purchases while medical supplies were bought secondhand. Why they'd kicked out the only person keeping these children alive. Their lawyer tried to object, to redirect, but the damage was done. The social worker had seen through their act completely. At exactly 5 p.m., she made her decision. All 6 children would be placed with me immediately. Emergency foster care licenses would be expedited. The children could be moved as soon as medical transport was arranged. My parents erupted. My father shouted about lawsuits, about appeals, about connections he had in the state government. My mother screamed that I was stealing her babies, the same babies she'd never once bathed or fed or comforted in the night. Security had to escort them out. I sat in the suddenly quiet office, tears streaming down my face. The social worker handed me tissue after tissue, letting me process the moment. After 2 years of fighting, of working multiple jobs, of watching the children suffer in separate placements, I was finally bringing them home. She helped me arrange medical transport for each child. Sadie would come directly from the ICU tomorrow morning. Caleb would be picked up from his placement by noon. Millie needed to stop at the hospital first to treat her infection, but she'd be home by evening. The other 3 would arrive throughout the day. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked through the house, checking each room again and again. Everything was perfect. Everything was ready. But I wouldn't believe it was real until all 6 children were safely under my roof. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It was a photo of my parents at the airport, bags in hand. A friend who worked security had seen them buying one-way tickets to Florida. They were running, probably afraid of the criminal charges the judge had mentioned. They'd chosen their money over everything else, right to the end. I deleted the text and the photo. They didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that in 12 hours, Sadie would be breathing comfortably in her own room. Caleb would have someone who understood his signs. Millie would get proper medical care. The twins would be together again. The youngest would have consistent breathing treatments. The retired nurse who'd volunteered to help arrived at 6 a.m., ready for the children's arrival. My CNA supervisor had given me 2 weeks off to get everyone settled. The community that had rallied around us continued to offer support. Meal trains, respite care, therapy services for the children's trauma. As I waited for the first medical transport to arrive, I thought about the 9-year-old girl who'd been thrown into an impossible situation. She'd done her best with no training, no support, no choice. Now, as an adult with proper training and a community of support, I could finally give these children what they deserved. The transport pulled up at 8 a.m. exactly. Through the window, I could see Sadie's small form on the stretcher, still connected to her ventilator but stable. The crew carefully maneuvered her inside, transferring her to the bed I'd prepared. The moment they had her settled, I took her hand. Her eyes fluttered open and focused on me. I sang our song, the one that had always calmed her. Her oxygen levels, which had been fluctuating during transport, steadied immediately. She was home. They would all be home soon. By evening, all 6 children were settled in their rooms. Caleb had spent an hour signing rapidly, telling me everything that had happened in his silent world. Millie was already responding better to her feeds with proper care. The twins had refused to let go of each other. The youngest was breathing easier than he had in months. I stood in the hallway that night, listening to the familiar sounds of monitors and machines. But this time, I wasn't alone. The nurse was here for the night shift. Tomorrow, more help would come. The children had proper equipment, proper supplies, proper care. My parents were gone, their schemes failed, their greed exposed. The state was investigating their previous years as foster parents. Other children they'd taken in were being tracked down, their cases reviewed. The money they'd stolen couldn't be recovered, but justice was still being served. Most importantly, 6 children who'd been failed by the system, scattered and neglected, were now together and safe. The way the parents tried every single trick to stop her is mind-blowing. Calling to cancel medical equipment, filing fake complaints about her license, even showing up with made-up witnesses. They had a long road of healing ahead. Trust would need to be rebuilt, medical issues addressed, educational gaps filled. But we had time now. We had support. We had a future. I made my rounds one last time before trying to sleep. Sadie's ventilator hummed steadily. Caleb had fallen asleep with his hands still forming words in his dreams. Millie's feeding pump delivered nutrition to her healing body. The twins slept in the same room, finally able to see each other. The youngest breathed without struggle. 6 children who deserved love and competent care finally had both. The 9-year-old girl who'd been forced to grow up too fast could finally rest. The system that had failed us was being forced to change. And somewhere in Florida, 2 people who'd chosen money over children's lives would have to live with their choices forever. The house was full of mechanical sounds and sleeping breaths. It was perfect. It was home. And this time, no one could take it away. The first week with all 6 children home tested every skill I'd developed over the years. Tuesday morning, barely 24 hours after they'd arrived, Sadie's ventilator alarm went off at 3 a.m. The retired nurse and I worked together to clear the blockage while I fought muscle memory from my childhood. The panic, the isolation, the knowledge that a mistake could be fatal. This time was different. The nurse guided me through proper protocols while I held Sadie's hand. patient. Her oxygen levels stabilized within minutes. The equipment was new, properly maintained. We had backup supplies. Most importantly, I wasn't alone. Wednesday brought a visit from the state inspector. My parents had filed yet another complaint, claiming the house wasn't up to code. The inspector arrived with a checklist and a frown, clearly expecting to find violations. Instead, she found a home that exceeded every requirement. The volunteers who'd helped set up had thought of everything. Proper electrical outlets for medical equipment, wheelchair-accessible bathrooms, clear emergency evacuation routes. The inspector spent extra time in Caleb's room, where I'd installed visual alarms and a communication board. She watched him eagerly showing me drawings he'd made of our new house, his hands flying as he signed about having his own space. Before leaving, she mentioned that my setup could serve as a model for other medical foster homes. Thursday afternoon, my lawyer called with news. The district attorney's office had opened a fraud investigation into my parents based on the evidence from our hearing. They'd subpoenaed financial records going back 10 years. Initial findings showed my parents had claimed expenses for medical equipment they'd never purchased, therapy services the children never received, and nursing care that didn't exist. The investigation also revealed something that made my stomach turn. My parents had taken in 2 other medically fragile children before Sadie, Caleb, and Millie. Both had been removed within months due to failure to thrive. The investigator couldn't locate either child's current placement. More files to review, more potential victims of my parents' greed. Friday marked our first full week together, and the children's improvements were already visible. Millie's infection had cleared with proper treatment. Her feeding schedule was consistent, and she'd gained 2 pounds. The twins were sleeping through the night in the same room, no longer crying for each other. The youngest's breathing treatments were on schedule, preventing the emergencies that had plagued his previous placement. But Caleb's progress moved me most. Each day, he remembered more signs. He'd started teaching the twins basic signs for hungry, tired, and play. During afternoon therapy, covered by the state, not out of pocket, his therapist used video calls with an ASL interpreter. For the first time in months, Caleb could fully express himself. The weekend brought unexpected challenges. A process server showed up Saturday morning with papers. My parents were suing me for defamation, emotional distress, and theft of property. They claimed the crowdfunded money belonged to them. My lawyer had warned me this might happen. She'd already prepared our response, documenting how every dollar had gone directly to the children's care. More concerning was the second set of papers. My parents had somehow convinced a different judge to review the custody decision. The hearing was set for the following month. They'd hired a new lawyer, someone known for taking questionable cases if the money was right. My stomach turned thinking about another battle, but I looked at the children playing in the living room, Caleb teaching Sadie finger painting while the twins watched, and knew I'd fight as many times as necessary. Sunday's challenge came from an unexpected source. Millie's biological grandmother contacted social services, expressing interest in placement. She'd been searching for Millie since birth, but hadn't been considered initially due to her age and health issues. Now, seeing news of the custody battle on local social media, she wanted to meet her granddaughter. The social worker arranged a supervised visit at our house. I spent the morning sick with worry. These children had been through enough upheaval. But when the grandmother arrived, a soft-spoken woman with Millie's same eyes, something shifted. She didn't demand anything. Instead, she asked questions about Millie's care, took notes about her feeding schedule, and cried when Millie grasped her finger. Before leaving, she pulled me aside. She wasn't seeking custody. Her health wouldn't allow it, but she wanted to be part of Millie's life, to share family photos and stories when Millie was older. She'd been fighting my parents' initial placement for years, knowing something was wrong but unable to prove it. She pressed a small photo album into my hands. Millie's birth parents, young and overwhelmed but loving. Another piece of these children's stories I could preserve for them. The second week brought routine medical appointments. Loading 6 children with complex medical needs into a van, even with help, took military precision. Oxygen tanks, emergency supplies, feeding pumps, communication devices, all had to be transported safely. At the children's hospital, staff who remembered me from my visits during their separate placements saw the difference immediately. Sadie's pulmonologist couldn't believe her improvement. Her lung function had increased 15% in just 2 weeks of consistent care. He adjusted her ventilator settings and scheduled a follow-up to discuss gradually reducing her dependency. Not rushing, not pushing, but acknowledging that with proper care, she might need less mechanical support over time. The appointments revealed other issues neglected in their previous placements. Caleb needed new hearing aids. His had been broken for months. The twins both showed signs of developmental delays from being separated. The youngest had untreated allergies that exacerbated his breathing problems. Each discovery made me angry at the system that had failed them, but also grateful we could address these issues now. Midweek, an unexpected ally emerged. The judge who'd heard our initial case had been following up on the fraud investigation. He'd discovered that my parents had judge shopped for their new hearing, filing in a district where they'd made significant campaign contributions. He couldn't intervene directly, but he ensured the new judge received complete case files, including evidence of my parents' fraud. My CNA supervisor called with more support. The hospital had approved extended family medical leave and would hold my position for 6 months. My coworkers had donated their vacation days to ensure I'd still receive partial pay. The hospital administrator, moved by our story, had arranged for the children to receive re-therapy services through their pediatric program. The community support continued in smaller, vital ways. Neighbors organized meal deliveries 3 times a week. A local church group did our laundry every Wednesday. High school students volunteered for yard work. Each act of kindness reminded me that we weren't alone, that these children were finally surrounded by people who saw them as precious, not profitable. 3 weeks in, we faced our first real medical emergency. The youngest developed severe respiratory distress during dinner. His lips turned blue despite his regular treatments. The retired nurse and I worked in synchronized efficiency, administering emergency medication, calling 911, preparing his medical history for paramedics. At the hospital, doctors discovered he'd developed pneumonia, likely from aspiration during feeds at his previous placement. He'd need several days of intensive treatment. I stayed with him, sleeping in the uncomfortable chair beside his bed, while the nurse managed the other 5 at home. The hospital social worker noted my presence, adding another positive report to our growing file. During his hospitalization, I received a call that made my hands shake. The fraud investigation had uncovered evidence of my parents hiding assets. They'd transferred significant money to offshore accounts over the years, far more than they'd reported to the IRS. Federal investigators were now involved. My parents' house of cards was collapsing. My lawyer explained that with federal charges likely, my parents would have bigger problems than fighting for custody. Their new lawyer had already withdrawn from the case. The judge-shopped hearing was postponed indefinitely, but I couldn't celebrate. None of this would undo the years of trauma these children had endured. The youngest came home after 5 days, weak but stable. The other children had made cards for him, Caleb's featuring elaborate drawings of superheroes fighting germs. That evening, I found all 6 of them piled carefully on the living room floor, the older ones telling stories while monitoring the younger ones' medical equipment. Someone should tell those parents that offshore accounts work better when you're not actively committing federal fraud. Their financial planning skills match their parenting abilities perfectly. They'd become a real family. Week 4 brought evaluations from the children's therapeutic team. The reports were comprehensive, documenting dramatic improvements in all 6 children. Weight gain, better respiratory function, increased communication, improved emotional regulation. The therapist noted that the children showed secure attachment behaviors, seeking comfort when distressed, exploring their environment confidently, engaging in age-appropriate play. One therapist pulled me aside after Caleb's session. She'd worked with him during his previous placement and barely recognized him now. The withdrawn, frustrated child had transformed into an engaged, expressive boy eager to communicate. She'd recommended he start attending the deaf school part-time, with support services for his medical needs. Real education, real peers, real childhood experiences. The custody review came faster than expected. With my parents under federal investigation and their lawyer withdrawn, the judge expedited the hearing. This time, the courtroom was packed with supporters. The retired nurse testified about the children's care. The hospital administrator confirmed my employment stability. Millie's grandmother spoke about my dedication. The judge reviewed everything: the initial placement, the removal, the failed separate placements, the dramatic improvements since reunification. He noted the extensive community support, the proper medical care, the therapeutic progress. His decision was swift and final. Permanent custody granted, with provisions for continued state support for the children's medical needs. But the judge went further. He ordered a review of all medical foster placements in the state, citing systemic failures that had allowed my parents' abuse to continue for years. He recommended mandatory training for foster parents of medically fragile children and regular audits of medical expense claims. Small changes, but ones that might protect future children. As we left the courthouse, I carried the youngest while Caleb held my hand. The twins walked between the nurse and a volunteer, and Sadie was pushed in her wheelchair by the same paramedic who'd responded to her emergency weeks ago. Millie rode in her stroller, pushed by her grandmother who'd become a regular visitor. That evening, after medical routines and bedtime stories, I stood in the hallway listening to the familiar sounds of monitors and machines, but now they were accompanied by other sounds: Caleb's gentle snoring, the twins whispering to each other, Millie's contented sighs. The mechanical sounds of survival were still there, but they no longer dominated. Life had found its way in. The next morning brought a certified letter. My parents had been arrested on federal fraud charges. Their assets were frozen pending investigation. They'd been released on bail with strict conditions: no contact with me or the children, no leaving the state, regular check-ins with federal authorities. Their Florida escape plan had failed. I felt no satisfaction reading the letter. No victory in their downfall. Just a hollow ache for the childhood I'd lost and the years these children had suffered. But dwelling on the past wouldn't help anyone. We had work to do, morning medications to administer, therapy appointments to attend, lives to build. 6 months later, our days had found rhythm. Morning medical routines followed by breakfast together. Caleb attended deaf school 3 days a week. The twins were in developmental preschool. Home health aides provided respite care so I could work part-time. The children were thriving in ways I'd never dared imagine during those desperate nights in separate placements. My parents' trial proceeded without us. I'd provided testimony via deposition, protecting the children from courtroom trauma. They'd eventually pled guilty to avoid maximum sentences: 5 years federal prison, massive fines, and restitution to the state for fraudulent claims. They'd lost everything chasing money that was meant to help vulnerable children. The restitution would go into trust funds for each child's future medical and educational needs. It wouldn't undo the damage, but it would ensure they'd never want for proper care again. Millie's grandmother helped establish the trusts, using her banking experience to protect the children's assets from future exploitation. Our house had transformed from a medical facility to a home. Yes, we still had equipment and supplies and schedules, but we also had finger paintings on the refrigerator, toys scattered in the living room, and the beautiful chaos of 6 children growing up together. The mechanical sounds that once dominated were now just background noise to laughter, signing conversations, and bedtime stories. Some nights, I still woke in panic, muscle memory from years of being solely responsible for keeping children alive. But then I'd hear the nurse's quiet footsteps, see the properly functioning equipment, feel the weight of community support surrounding us. We'd built something my 9-year-old self could never have imagined: a real family, supported and stable. The children still faced challenges. Sadie might always need respiratory support. Caleb would navigate a hearing world that didn't always accommodate him. Millie's feeding issues required constant vigilance. The twins and the youngest carried invisible scars from early medical trauma, but they faced these challenges with consistent care, proper resources, and the unshakable knowledge that they were loved. As I made evening rounds, checking equipment and tucking in blankets, I thought about the long journey from that first night when 9-year-old me had fumbled with medical equipment I didn't understand. That little girl had done her best with impossible circumstances. Now, as an adult with training and support, I could give these children what they'd always deserved: not just survival, but the chance to truly live. Thanks for hanging out and diving into all this with me. Seriously, I love getting to just explore weird, interesting stuff together. It's always a ride. Alright, until next time, take care out there. Like the video, it helps more than you think.